All right.
We've got a few seats up front here onto the side. Yes, sir. Right. Anyone has an empty seat next to you, raise your hand. Or not. I got two of them right up here. If anyone's looking for a seat, raise your hand if you got an empty seat next to you. Thank you. Well, I think we're going to get started here in a couple of minutes. I've got the live streaming going on right now, so we'll see how that works today. And how's the temperature in here for everyone? All right, if it gets a little warm, someone by the fire escape door open that up. I thought I'd never say that a week ago. Well, I think we're going to start. If everyone's ready, Bill.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Liz.
I'm ready.
Very good. So, let me get a couple more minutes. If anybody needs a seat, come on up front. Raise your hand if you got a seat open next to you. Got a couple up front. We've been saving those for you specifically. Could you raise your hand if you have a seat next to you? We got one right up here if anyone needs a seat. And we got one up clear in the front on the right side, speaker's right side. I think we're going to start the program. I want to thank everyone for coming out today. And my name is Tim, and I take care of this building, Constitution Hall. And this is the second program. Last Sunday was the first of a 6-part series, the Bleeding Kansas 2019. This is the 23rd year that we've been doing this, and it's a collaborative effort between Constitution Hall, Territorial Capitol Museum, and all of you that support this program series. And I know there's a lot of important people out here, and I'm going to try to recognize some of you. But I think probably the most important person to recognize is Charlene Winter. Charlene, come in here. Come into the room, would you? Or is she busy? Charlene Winter, there she is right there. Raise your hand, Charlene. Charlene's in charge of the cookies here today. She brings them every Sunday. Thank you. And I just noticed also, Ron, please stand. Ron Ellis, the state representative from Jefferson County. Thank you, sir, for supporting history. Thank you for being a friend of history. And with that, I'm going to, did I miss anyone else? Okay, with that, also I wanted to recognize a newspaper man in Jefferson County, and this, Clark, raise your hand. This is Clark Davis with the Valley Falls Vindicator. Very nice article you did, Clark. And this is a real newspaper. Look how white it is. It's not from this. And the Oskaloosa Independent. He's a publisher and editor. So thank you, Clark. You've always been a great friend to Historical Compton. So you didn't come here today for me to speak. I just want to say welcome to the program series. And today our program is entitled Stop the Press's Late Breaking News from Bleeding Kansas. And it's going to be presented by Liz Leach, And also, she's a former journalist and an adjunct instructor at Northwestern University and the University of Kansas. And Mr. Bill Knoll, right there, professional land surveyor and director of the Jefferson County Public Works Department. Now, Liz, and also I want to recognize her husband, Steve, right there. He's going to be helping out with the IT. He probably came the farthest to be at this program today. I think it was 10 time zones that you came from to make it here today, so thank you for doing that. Liz graduated from Oskaloosa High School. She's a bear. And the William Allen White School of Journalism at the University of Kansas. She now resides with her husband, Steve, in Mercer Island, Washington State. She spent her professional career as a journalist and is today a researcher and writer and historian researching Jefferson County, Kansas. And its territorial and Civil War history from 1855 to 1865. And Mr. Bill Knoll right there is also a graduate of Oskaloosa High School and Missouri Western State University with a degree in construction engineering. And he has been the Jefferson County Public Works Director since 2014. And this is the first appearance by Liz and Bill. So how about a nice round of applause and welcome here to Thanksgiving.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today. As Tim mentioned, I've been researching Jefferson County territorial period and Civil War period for about 7 years. 7 years, this is something that never would have occurred to me in my entire life. Except I got a phone call about 7 years ago from a man named Keith Middlemass, who's from Oskaloosa. He's a stonemason. And he called and said that someone had called him and indicated that they might be buying this property, which has a beautiful two-story white wood frame house in front of it. Might be buying it and knocking it down to build something else. I don't know what it was. I don't know how serious it was. And they had called Keith to ask him if he wanted the rocks or the stones from this. So he called me because he knew I wanted a place to live out on our farm that still exists in Jefferson County. And if this happened, did I want him to build a little cabin from that? Because he could reconstruct it. And I thought, well, that sounds like a lot of work. And then I began thinking more about it because I lived across the highway from this place. I grew up and I knew it and used to walk past that stone cabin all the time going back to the pasture where our horses were. And I thought, well, it must be really old. And I didn't know. I knew nothing about Jefferson County, really, even though my father did. And that started me wondering, well, who lived there? Because it does look really old. And I've been hearing a lot about Lecompton doing a lot of renovation and preserving its history here, as it's very important. And I think there's even a little stone cabin similar to that they've recently moved.
Liz, could you put that closer? So
okay. Here? Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. And so I started looking up what it might have been, which took me to the courthouse. And it was oddly difficult to find out what that was. The stone house has not been recorded on any tax records because it's an outbuilding, so we didn't know that. We didn't know whose it was. Finally found out after looking at a Kansas Supreme Court case and going to the county appraiser who looked at the rods and other measurements for that place, and he found out it had been the homestead of Jess Newell, which he was the co-founder of the town, so we all knew who Jess Newell was. And his descendants are still around, and there's one right back there. And, oh, two. Say hi. And so we all knew who he was, but we had collectively forgotten where he lived. And so that made it more interesting. And so then it became an issue of trying to find out about Jess Newell. And so I looked around, and we had what an historian, Rita Napier, who's not living anymore, would call an origin story. So the origin story for Oskaloosa was very brief, and it was pretty much all we still had. There hadn't been any new research into the origin story, but it was something like this. In 1855, Jess Newell, his sons, his brother-in-law, Joseph Fitzsimmons, came down from Iowa in 1855 to look for a place to settle. And so they looked around, they found a place that had a spring. They liked it. It was near Oskaloosa. And two of his sons, Jess Newell's sons, Valentine and the other son was John, stayed, but they stayed near Rossville, and the rest of them went back to Iowa. They came back a year later, this is still the standard history, and moved in. And Jess Newell moved into he bought a log cabin that was near this in 1856 and moved into that. And the first record we could find of anything being on his homestead property was the wood frame house was built in 1860. So we knew sometime between the 1856 and 1860 was when that went up. So that was all we knew about Jess Newell. And still didn't know if the property was going to be sold or not sold, but kept looking, and to my surprise, I couldn't really find anything at the State Historical Society about it either, and except they had one index card, and it was on Jess Newell, but it was on Jess Newell's grandson, Jess Newell, who lived in Ozaki, and that was it. So there was nothing. So I did what any good researcher would do now, and I don't call myself an historian, even though Tim did. I Googled him. So once I filtered out all the stuff relating to the sports writer Jess Newell, I was shocked to find the first big item that I found on Jess Newell online in a blog someone else had written, and it was quoting a letter written by Cecilia Sherman from Ohio, who had been with her husband, John Sherman, the brother of the general, to investigate in 1856 all the voting irregularities that had happened in Kansas and all the violence. Yes. Jess Newell had arrived 3 days earlier in May, and he was trying to get, he had some mules, and he was going to take the mules. This is not part of the origin story, by the way, from Topeka to Lawrence. And Lawrence was being surrounded by the pro-slaver people and their own militia and the border ruffians because they were about to attack it again for all the insurrectionists who lived in Lawrence, the abolitionists and the traders who were not obeying the laws. And so he kept being stopped by these people, and he got mad, and he was with some other people, and he turned around and came back to Lecompton, and I have to ask him where the governor would have been. Where would the governor have been in 1856? Where would Shannon have been? In this building, Tim? Where would Governor Shannon have been in May 1856 in Lecompton? So Jess Newell turned around, came back, and found the governor, whom he knew from Ohio, which is where Jess Newell was born. And he asked the governor why he couldn't, in a free country, get from Lecompton to Lawrence with his mules. And he was mad, and The governor said, I can't do anything about it. We've got something going on in Lawrence. There's going to be a fight. You can't go. And that made Newell madder. And so he followed the governor into his office, wherever that office was, and said, you know me from Ohio. I won't be treated this. I want to go to Lawrence and sell the mules, whatever he's going to do with his mules. And he got a pass. He got a permit from the governor to go. And so he flashed the permit every time he got stopped, and he made it to Lawrence. But he then went to see the people writing the report about the troubles and things. And Mrs. Sherman, he's not in the actual 1,300-page report, but he's in a letter that this woman wrote to her sister about what was going on in Kansas and how terrible it was. And she said that she had run into Jess Newell. So that was the first big thing we found online about Jess Newell we didn't know. The second big thing was, I was Googling again, filtering out the sports writer, Jess Newell, and there was something about the Underground Railroad and Jess Newell. And there was an article in one of the Kansas State Historical Society books about the rescue of John Dory, who was an underground. How many people don't know who John Dory was? Okay. Don't know? Okay. John Dory was a Lawrence person. Excuse me. He was an abolitionist. Judy Sweets, back there, knows more about him and the Underground Railroad than anyone. And he was leading 13 people, 11 were enslaved people, 2 were free black people. He was going to take them north through Holton and then up on through Iowa. Other people would take it from there. And the article I read was about the rescue of John Dory because he got ambushed and all the slaves got taken and sold back down south. And John Dory, the Lawrence man, got put in jail in Missouri. So this story was about how those 10 people, the immortal 10, busted John Dory out of jail in Missouri and brought him back. So at the very end of this long and extremely fascinating story was a paragraph that said from at Valley Falls, they had someone they could go to that was Josiah McAfee, and he was a minister there. So they stopped on their way back at McAfee's house. And then, since they thought they were being followed by Missouri people, he sent, and he is James Abbott, who organized this Immortal 10 rescue, sent for Jess Newell, and they all came, and Jess Newell and his rifle company escorted them back to Lawrence. So this is online, and I'm going, what? Why does Jess Newell have a rifle company, and they're calling him captain, and it's 1859, so this was all new. And it also helped to confirm a vague written historical theory that Oskaloosa was part of the Underground Railroad in some way, but we didn't really have anything. So that was the second big thing. So I started looking at that and started cold calling people because I used to do that all the time when I was a reporter. And about 3 people said I should talk to Judy Sweets, who's back there and is giving, I think, the final lecture here. And yes, she knew something about it, and she knew Jess Newell's name, and she knew something else about it. And I don't think she wanted to tell me what it was, but kindly, she eventually did, and she had an old newspaper clipping that was a transcript of a journal that belonged to John Dory, who had foolishly written down all the places he was going to stop on his Underground Railroad trip with all the names. And when they captured him up in Jefferson County, they took this and they used it in the trial against him, and also published it in newspapers, so all those people were exposed. But anyway, I can understand why Judy didn't want to give it to her. She was very kind. And so that was our next big thing about Jess Newell. And so then we saw that the ambush had happened earlier in January 1859, and it was described as 12 miles north of Lawrence and 8 south of Oskaloosa, and there were descriptions of the road and a bluff. And I started thinking, well, we should be able to figure out where that was. And it also looks like half of Jefferson County, if you describe it that way. But started thinking about it, and I decided we would try to find it because I couldn't see anywhere that Edwin had tried to find the ambush site. So I called Candace Griffiths and said, who knows the area around Buck Creek? And she said, Jennifer Binkley does. She used to ride her horses there. So I called Jennifer Binkley. And Jennifer was working on a book, The Forgotten Road, at the time, so she was looking anew at all those old roads around there. And so I decided we're going to get 3 people to look at this, and I'll be one, and Jennifer will be one. Then I'll call someone who knows the roads. So I thought, well, Bill Knoll will know the old roads. And that's all I was thinking, old roads. It's probably a road that's still there. And so I got the 3 people, I gave them, we all had the clues, and I got my husband, Steve, but we drove up from Lawrence. I had my phone in hand trying to figure out, okay, this is 12 miles up, 8 down. We were on Buck Creek Road, and we came up to a curve, and I said, this is it. This has to be it. They could have hidden right behind that hill. And, yeah, changes life. That's Jess Newell's. So. Go back one. Those are the clues that we had. They're all slightly different, but each provides a little bit more information. One of them has the business about the ferries, and that helped to give us a mileage distance. So anyway, I was wrong about what I thought was the place on Buck Creek because the hill was on the wrong side of the road. So Jennifer and Candace Griffiths, who introduced me to Jennifer, they're in that picture. So the picture on the upper left is my incorrect guess with the little red arrow in it. It is Buck Creek Road. Jennifer is looking at an area that's much closer to the actual site. And then the other picture with no people in it is what Jennifer was looking at with Candace on horseback. So from there.
You forgot to mention you were on horseback.
Oh, I was on horseback too. Those are June bugs' ears. Yeah, it's not the last time I was on horseback too. So then I asked, well, Bill Knoll, maybe he'll know something too. I kind of think we've got it, but we'll just ask Bill Knoll. So I did, and Bill, if you want to take it from here and explain what you did with your guesses.
Okay. I'm going to change the PowerPoint. There were some handouts in the back. I don't know if there's any left, but it'll be pretty small for the map. All right, so like they said, I am the Public Works Director of the county for Jefferson County. I'm a licensed surveyor in the state of Kansas, licensed surveyor number 1599 to be exact. So there's about 1,630 licensed surveyors throughout the history of Kansas. I do some work on the side and mostly in the public works director for Jefferson County. So Liz approached me one day. I can't remember. She may have been at the commissioner meeting or something, and she said she's looking for a road. I know she talked to the GIS department and the appraiser's office and had looked at a lot of maps. And so she presented me with a few descriptions of the roadway and some other information, and I thought, okay, I'll look through this and see what I can come up with. So from John Doy's book, it reads, crossed the Kansas River at Lawrence and traveled through the Delaware Reservation towards Oskaloosa. So that gives us our first clue. Where is the Delaware Reservation in Jefferson County? We currently don't have any reservations. We have Call Half-Breed Indian lands. We have a Delaware Reserve line. It's a diagonal line that runs across the county that had to do with other historical information. But what exactly is the Delaware Reservation in Jefferson County? And then it says went about 12 miles from Lawrence and 8 miles from Oskaloosa. So that gives us a general location of where this ambush may have happened. You know, it's not exactly 20 miles between Lawrence and Oskaloosa, but it gives us a really good starting point. And then it says we have a long descent before us. So you know that you're going to be descending a hill at this location as a part of the ambush. And then from Abbott, the guy who I was told was responsible for the rescue, he also confirmed that it's about 12 miles from Lawrence. So the first thing, you're going to leave Lawrence. Well, the city of Lawrence, when Douglas County was created, many of you probably know in this room, Jefferson County did go all the way to the Kansas River. So here's a map that depicts that prior to the annexation of the portion that used to be Jefferson County. And so they did cross the river. Down here somewhere in the Lawrence area, there are a couple different ferry locations. And then up here at the top is where Buck Creek is, which is several miles. And so we had that information. So I drew two radiuses using Google Maps, and I overlapped them. And so the first one I started from approximately 6th and Mass, and thought, okay, this could be what they call downtown Lawrence. It could have been the Capitol building. There's probably a mile, or the courthouse. There's approximately a mile between those. But when you're looking at Oskaloosa, Oskaloosa's small, and when you say downtown Oskaloosa, you're referring to the square. And so I drew a secondary 8-mile radius starting from the center of the courthouse, and then I looked at those areas. They did not intersect exactly. So the 12-mile radius from Lawrence took you much farther north in an area that did not have descending hills. That you were going up a lot of grades. If you were traveling from Lawrence to Oskaloosa, it would not have been an area that you would have descended a hill. From Doy's journal that got published in the St. Joe newspaper, it says, ferried over the Kaw River at Lawrence, took the road west up the river, and so he traveled along the river. He wasn't traveling directly towards the city of Oskaloosa, which is kind of indicated to me that the 12-mile radius may have not been accurate anyway, because if you're going to travel west, then back north, and you're traveling 12 miles, you're not really taking a direct path. And so then it says crossing Buck Creek. So you know they crossed Buck Creek. They didn't go up the east side of Buck Creek. When they got to Buck Creek, they actually crossed the creek. And then it says keeping the left-hand road till the creek is crossed, and then the right-hand road. So they crossed the creek at a road that there must have been a fork at the road, and they took the left fork. And then once they got across the creek, they had to take the right fork. And so also from John Doy's book, we have they crossed the Kansas River at Lawrence, and they traveled through what's referred to here as the Delaware Reservation. And so taking that information, I thought, okay, roads aren't where they were in 1855. I know that they were looking for roads that were around in 1855. There are a few roads throughout the state of Kansas, northeast Kansas, that still, you have your Fort Leavenworth, Fort Riley Highway that runs through the northern portion of Jefferson County. You have some old military trails, but primarily you had trails that aren't in the same location as the road. Most of those have been moved to sectionalized areas, but we have the GLO maps from when Jefferson County was split up in the mid 1850s. The maps, it was a multi-year process, but approximately in 1852. And so up here on the screen, it's pretty small, but you can see on your maps, if you have a handout, the road forks just prior to Buck Creek, just as the description read. You can take the right-hand road or you can take the left-hand road on the original GLO map. So then, once you cross the creek, you have another split in the road. You can take the left-hand road or the right-hand road. And so they took the left-hand road at the creek, and then once they crossed the creek, they took the right-hand road. There's a section of roadway that's missing here, but these roads probably did connect. They wouldn't have had two major roads that were shown. They were trails, had been around a long time, but they wouldn't have been shown on the map. And then also, you have the GLO labeling this the Delaware Trust Land. And so, not exactly the same as a reservation. I'm not sure exactly. I have never researched or looked into what exactly that qualified as, but it is labeled here on the GLO, so we have a redundancy of facts at that location. And then up here, we had the area, we had the general area of where the 8-mile radius intersected, so you can follow the road going north to this general location. So I knew that all GLO notes or GLO maps, all surveys that were accompanied by maps that gave descriptions of the terrain. This is how people back east decided the value of land that they were buying to prospect. So it would have been described, walnuts, oaks, if it had springs, if it had running water, a creek going through it, if it was rolling meadow, it sometimes gave the soil types. But if there was a Lawrence-Oskaloosa highway, it would have probably shown up somewhere in these notes because there would have been a roadway traveling through the property that had been of interest to somebody who hadn't seen it and may be considering purchasing it. So here in the notes from 1862, it says at 65 chains, the Lawrence and Oskaloosa Road ran northwest and southeast as it intersected the section line that they were establishing at that time. So, using mapping, they began at 65 chains from the northwest corner of the section. 65 chains. I'll speak to chains and different measuring techniques in a minute, just for a second. But 65 chains, a chain is 66 feet, so that's 4,290 feet. So they were going to travel 4,290 feet along that section line, and they intersected the Lawrence-Oskaloosa Highway that was traveling in a northwesterly, southeasterly direction. And so this map kind of depicts the point of beginning and where that roadway was. That told me a secondary thing. I knew from when Liz had talked to me that they were looking on Buck Creek. There were no right-hand hills, which we'll get to in a second, and we're in a location with this Oskaloosa Highway that was definitely not in the same location as Buck Creek was. So the next thing I looked at was the topography of the land. So from John Doy's book, it said we had quite a long descent before us, and we would go down at a brisk pace. And at the bottom of the hill, on the right of the road, is a bluff. And from behind this, as we turned, came some 20 or more men. And so I looked at this area where we knew the roadway was at from the GLO notes. We knew that the Lawrence-Oskaloosa Highway intersected it at a general location just west of this pond. And we knew that they traveled down a hill. And so you look at the topography at this location, where the road came down the hill and left the high ground isn't specifically known. But at some point, they traveled down down these contour lines. And I don't know how many people in here are familiar with contour lines, but the closer the contour line is to each other, the steeper the hill. And so these contour lines are extremely close. So at some point, whether it be down here a little bit to the south or right here, near this location, the Lawrence-Oskaloosa Highway traversed down into that low area, and then came along that low area through this draw and came out somewhere near this pond location, and then turned back to high ground and went in a northwesterly direction. You have two large bluffs right here with a large draw going north. They're at the right-hand side of the road as you travel from Lawrence to Oskaloosa. There's almost a 70-foot elevation difference if you were traveling in the bottom of that area versus standing on top of that bluff. As you can see, there's both of these areas, all three of these bluffs areas have draws going up them that would have made for a very easy hiding spot. It would have been an ideal spot to ambush someone based upon how narrow it is. So once you're in that draw, you're not going to turn around very easily if you're in a wagon. Putting together this PowerPoint, I thought to myself, I don't want to get up here and give out a bunch of false information and have no idea. Why would the road go down into a draw? It doesn't make a lot of sense. The easiest travel course would be up on top of a hill. But with the pond and the secondary small pond down here, it kind of indicates to me that this is an area that probably has a lot of spring activity. And so it would have been an area where people went down, traveled down to water their horses and cows and gather water. And then they would have then immediately came back out of that draw and made it back to high ground and traveled back towards the city of Oskaloosa. And so it gave a good indication of why they would have done that. Let's see here. So the site of the ambush, from those notes, the best available evidence points to it being right here where the X location is, or within maybe 150, 200 feet to the west of that location. But within 150, 200 feet, this is pretty much as accurate as you're going to get based upon the notes and the different information that we have. But the size of the X covers more than 50 feet, so you can move it anywhere you want to. And so that gives you the site of the ambush where they did this. I'll cover just a little bit of information. I don't know how my time's going. I'll cover a little bit of information, just kind of the history of the public land surveying system. And so at this time, the United States was in a lot of debt. They had purchased the Louisiana Purchase for pennies on the acre, and so they had all this land, and they needed to sell this land in order to pay off debt. And so they came to Ohio, and they said, we have to have an organized manner of measuring this land and trying to figure out how we're going to divide it up so we can make this into an asset that we can sell. And so they created the public land surveying system. And so they went out and they ran principal lines, principal meridians, and then they split up these areas into townships. And so they would run 6-mile townships, and then they would subdivide those 6-mile townships into, so they would divide the 6-mile townships into 1-mile square sections. They would start this process between sections 35 and 36 on the south line. They would run a true bearing north until they came 6 miles, and then they would close on their north line to the line they had previously already established. And so all of your error would be in your north half mile and your west half mile. And so they would come in here and they would subdivide all of these 6-mile squares into 36 sections to be sold off at a later date. It was one of the largest federal projects that had ever been undertaken. If you look at the amount of ground. If you look west of Ohio and you look at the shape of the states, it's dictated solely based upon the public land surveying system. And that's why we have everything in squares. It was a monumental task. It started in Ohio. So the next thing, I threw this in here just for an informational slide. A lot of people get confused because you have aliquot part legal descriptions. There's very few, maybe one or two in Jefferson County, intact square miles left where someone owns an entire section. It's very, very rare. It's becoming more and more uncommon. And so you get a lot of aliquot part legal descriptions where somebody may own an 80-acre that's the east half of the southeast quarter. Well, this slide, if you take it home with you and you ever wanted to look at it, kind of explains how an aliquot part legal description works. And then it has some information on chains. And so over here, actually downstairs, they had 2 half chains or 2 pole chains. A chain was 66 feet. They had an example downstairs of 2 that are sitting up here on this table that are 33 feet. So they would pull that in a true bearing line 80 times per mile, setting a stone every 40 chains. So they would pull 40 chains, a half mile, set a stone, and then they would do that again and again until they got to the end of the process. It took a long time, and I'm sure it was dangerous. So a rod, when you got into steep terrain, was 16.5 feet. It's a quarter of a chain. So they would turn quarter chains because they were measuring horizontally. And I can tell you from surveying that, the vast majority of the time you're going to hit their 2640 and their 5280 within 10 feet. So they were doing a pretty accurate job of measurement. And even in the closing on the 6 mile lines, generally they were still within a few hundred feet. Very rarely were they off a really large distance. They did a pretty good job. There are some areas in Kansas, you get down to the south central areas of Kansas, there are some areas where they had some people start running they ran a township line all the way down, never corrected for the curvature of the earth. And so you have some areas down there that is really messed up, and your last half mile is actually 4 miles. But the faster you could get it done, the more you got paid. So, highlighting some of Jefferson County's mapping. So, we mapped all of our section corners. We scanned them in, created a coding system. I don't know if Kirk Webb's here. I don't know if he made it, but Kirk wrote a computer code that took the naming technique that we created and put those in the right location on Jefferson County's map. So all the section corners, very few of the stones are still remaining. You occasionally still do come across stones, but the section corners are available. But interesting more to this today's discussion is the GLO maps are now available on the Jefferson County website under the Featured Online Maps section of the GIS page. So you can go to the Featured Online Maps, and if you're doing research or if you just enjoy looking at these type of things, you can go and you can look at different GLO maps. It's a little bit complicated. It's not extremely straightforward, but you can adjust the transparency. So we've geo-referenced these maps to be in the right location over the ground, and so you can adjust the transparency of the maps. So you can look at areas like those GLO maps showed where Indian villages were in different Indian communities in Jefferson County. So you can scroll that transparency back and forth, and you can see the general location that was on a current aerial. Also, on the GLO maps, you can see some of the different aspects of what the Bleeding Kansas series may be more interested in. You had towns. You can see on the right-hand side of this map, you have a town called Jacksonville. So Jacksonville doesn't exist today. It lies just east of Oskaloosa, and the city of Oskaloosa in 1852 didn't exist. And so you had a lot of towns that either were coming in, some of them were pro-slavery, and when Kansas became a free state, I think they kind of just diminished. Some of them came in, and people were trying to make money like they do today when they do developments, and they didn't get the railroad. And so if they didn't get a railroad stop, their town just died. So like if you look at Oskaloosa, I don't know the history of Jacksonville or what happened to it, but in other areas like in the northern part of the county, there's a community called Donovan. It was a pretty established city that had a railroad stop. Right next to it, there was a city called Hardville. May have just been a bad name, but they didn't put a railroad stop in there, so the city was never actually developed. So there's these town sites, a lot of them really throughout the county. There's Medina, Thompsonville, Hardville, Rock Creek is an unincorporated area that people are more familiar with. So there's all these different things you can look at. If you have questions, you can call the GIS department to walk you through this process, or you can call Public Works, and I can walk you through how to figuring out how to adjust the transparency on the mapping is kind of once you know how to do it, it's really easy, but figuring out how to find that option is a little bit difficult. Threw out two different related books. I figured this would be an audience that probably reads a lot. So the first is called Measuring America. It is written by a guy named Andrew Linklater, but it's a comprehensive book of the history of the standardization of weights and measures, and how that standardization of weights and measures was incorporated into the American experience, or how they split up lands and measured lands and valued lands. It talks a bit about George Washington and his family and how he was a surveyor and used that to gain great wealth. But it talks about the standardization of it. It talks about the creation of the public land surveying system. It's not a difficult read. You don't have to be a surveyor to understand it. It's a history book. And then Democracy in America is probably the most commonly quoted book in the United States for political speeches. And so it's an easy read too, but it kind of talks about the foundation of the democracy of the United States and what it was like in colonial New England. So that's what I had. I don't know if Liz is speaking again. We still have.
I am.
So I went a little over.
That was great.
All right.
And I have to say, I do have to say that having the GLO maps online in Jefferson County is a very cool thing. Closer
We
to
want to hear what you have to say. Speak up.
All right. So having those maps online is a lot of fun. First of all, you can look at everything, and some of the houses that were already there in 1855 are noted on the map. So it's a lot of fun, and I don't know if any other counties have as cool a GIS department as Jefferson County. And the other thing I'd say is Bill kept calling his locating of the Dory thing a guess. And I kept saying, this is not a guess. It is a spot. So he was a great help as well. So we should be on the 5th slide. Is that the 5th slide? Thank you. Can you back it up one more? Oh, all right. Okay, the next one with all the words on it, but you probably can't read in the back. But this is information that we were able to get about Jefferson County participants in the Underground Railroad that we hadn't had before. The newspaper that Judy Sweets had a clip from that described the route that John Dory was going to take that night and the places where John Dory was going to stop to get help. That wasn't online. It was in the Rochester, New York newspaper. I would not have thought to look there. And researchers, it's been difficult all these years, but now that has all changed, because even since I first spoke to Judy, all the newspapers are online and they're searchable. So it's a lot, not all of them are online, but a lot of them are online. And you can find all kinds of information from the past. And I have to say, this is an explosion of information that people who've been researching things should look at anew, because I think a lot of the stories we have are based on faulty information. You can improve them with new research, but that's besides the point. So now we had names of all these people associated with the Underground Railroad in Jefferson County. So the ones on the left are the names of the people who were helping with the rescue. So John Dory was ambushed in Jefferson County, and they took him over to Missouri with his son and another young man, Wilbur Clow, who was driving one of the wagons. They took all 13 of the people seeking freedom over to Missouri as well. 11 were enslaved people, and 2 were supposed to be free people. And all the, this is not the story I'm researching, but I know Judy is and everyone else, but those people apparently were sold down south. So this was a big disaster for them. With the Underground Railroad, the enslaved people took the biggest risk of all and what could happen to them. And so the worst happened with Dory. So the rescue was a big deal, and these people planned to bust him out of jail in a very Navy SEAL-like way. And you can read that story. I have it on my blog, but it's also in some historical society publications. And so the people listed in Mr. Abbott's story of how the rescue happened are there on the left. And so we have Reverend McAfee from Valley Falls, who was later moved to Topeka. He was an adjutant general for Kansas Civil War units. We have Jess Newell. We have Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte Hazen, who was I think he was part of what they called Lane's Army of the North. During territorial Kansas, pro-slavers were in abundance here, even though the New England Immigrant Aid Society had moved here early on. I think if it's closer, it'll work better. But then, as the violence increased, Jim Lane took a different tack from the New Englanders who wanted to be nonviolent, take the moral high ground. He was ready to fight. So he went up when he was supposed to be arrested once he left. Went to New York and with a lot of other people campaigned to bring more settlers here who could get cheap land and help out in the fight. So I know that Jerome Hazen was one of those people. Then we have J.B. Forbes, or although it might be his brother Jotham. John Newell is one of Jess Newell's sons. Robert Newell is another of Jess Newell's sons, and he died in the Battle of Wilson Creek in 1861. And Gil Tower was another immigrant. I'm not sure when he came down, but James Monroe, Resolved Fuller, my favorite person, and M.R. Dutton. And then there are 8 or 10 others that we don't know who they are. I still don't know who they are. I don't think we'll ever know who they are. And so those were the people who Abbott somehow knew could be trusted to help them with this rescue. So that indicates to me there was probably some underground activity in Jefferson County as well. And Jefferson County wasn't the potted plant of bleeding Kansas that we might have thought it was. Next one. So this is a map that shows the 2 known Underground Railroad participant spots. And then 3 that are based on legend and rumor that Jefferson County's always kind of been aware of. So the 2 stars are Josiah McAfee up in Valley Falls, and the other is Jess Newell in Oskaloosa. The one up north is kind of barely in Nortonville, which is right on the county line with Atchison, but it's mostly there are Atchison Quakers and some other Underground Railroad participants up there. On the west side, we have Rock Creek, and there was a man named Jared Pierpont Barnes, and he is, a biography about him says he was another stop or an assist in the Underground Railroad. And then the other is William Hosford, and that's near McLeod. It was an area called Round Grove. But we don't know those, so if you know anything about them, let me know. Next slide. So this is, I'm showing you maps of routes, and we have to know that with the Underground Railroad, it was all supposed to be secret. So I doubt they took the same route over and over and over because it wouldn't be smart. But the Lane Trail is very well known as a route. And a lot of the written stories have involved the Lane Trail, which is called the Lane Trail because that's how they started bringing more Free Staters into Kansas. They also used it as an Underground Railroad route. So I tried to write the towns on it because it's a really difficult map. And so the other map was created by Kirk Webb in the Jefferson County GIS department. And he made the map based on this John Dory journal route that was going to happen, but it didn't happen because he was ambushed. And I can't see it from here, but the whole route was going up to Oskaloosa where he was, his first stop was Jess Newell's house, and he wrote that down. And he said that Jess Newell had agreed to help him. Then it goes on up with another stop in Valley Falls. And then if you follow the stars, it also goes to Holton, which a lot of them did because there were a lot of Free Staters there who would help people get out from that point. Okay, just leave it there a minute. So, those were the 2 big things that we were finding out about Jefferson County we didn't know. So the first one, we will go back to the letter from Mrs. Sherman, who encountered Jess Newell. And he was trying to get to Lecompton, or to Lawrence, stopped in Lecompton, and he talked to people doing this report. So the report is called the Howard Report, and it's one of the best documents there is for studying territorial Kansas because it writes down several of the elections that were held and how many people were signed up to vote in those and how many people actually voted in those and what the results were and what the problems were. And then in the back of the book, it has people telling about the violence that happened to them. So a lot of that is recorded. And I mentioned Rita Napier, and she said that a document like this and a second document about claims have not been used enough in the research of Kansas. And she maintained, and I think she's right, that the story has been dominated by the New England Immigrant Aid Society, which was great because they came here and they were organized and they had smart people. But a lot of other things that happened and a lot of the other people working to make Kansas free weren't part of that world, and they weren't recorded well in history by the Robinsons and some of the other people who were covering what happened in Bleeding, Kansas. So I'm going to have to walk over to this map, or to this list. This is, so that's from the actual book. I have one at home. I bought it used online. It was very cheap. It's in really bad shape. That's the cover. So this is showing total results in territorial Kansas of one election in 1855. And I know you can't read it in the back, but in the 1855 Kansas Census, they surveyed voters, which could only be white men, other people, and they also had columns for Negroes and slaves. So from this, you get a slave town for Kansas. And you have the poll list, you have the census, which documented on the top all the numbers of who was here and who could vote. And then on the bottom, they compiled the results of what actually happened in the election that followed the census by 2 months. And the numbers don't add up, and you can see that, and maybe I'll show it later so you can actually see the numbers. The bizarre numbers that came in from all the Missouri people coming across the line to vote. Next slide. This is a tiny precinct somewhere in Jefferson County. I think it's Hartville, which was named for Charles Hart. It's spelled many different ways. And it was near where Hickory Point was. And it had 6 voters, and they all voted pro-slavery. And it's interesting to me because 2 of them were Jess Newell's sons. Valentine Newell, and his name, I think, is spelled 3 ways on these lists, and John Newell, and then their brother-in-law, John Spurlock, which is Spurbeck in this. But it's funny because it's 6 people, and they all voted pro-slavery in this election. Okay, next one. So we're back to Cecilia Sherman's letter. This is her letter. And this was written about in the blog that I found online. The woman was writing about guns in America. Thank you. That's what it says. And this is Jess Newell's story. Can you read that in the back? Okay, I'll read it. Can you read it out loud? I can't see it.
The whole line?
Yeah.
The whole letter? I'm louder, so I'll get the story. Mr. Jesse Newell, formerly from near Olive'sburg, Ohio, and immediately from Iowa, gave us an account of his adventures the last 2 or 3 days, going from Topeka to Lawrence, but after having been stopped once or twice, he turned around and went to Lecompton, headquarters of the enemy, to see Governor Shannon, whom he knew. I would like to know, this is Jesse Newell speaking, I would like to know what these bands of armed men who are going around the country mean stopping peaceable citizens on the highway. I am a free man and thought I was in a free country till I came here. Shannon gave him a permit to get through. Newell went on toward Lawrence, but was stopped twice by groups armed with rifles and fixed bayonets. They asked Newell where he was from, when he came, what town he had been, where he was been going. He had been traveling in D I think is an obscenity blanked out. Damned abolition. I can say it. He wouldn't write it. He had been traveling in damned abolition towns and speculated was going to Lawrence to help fight the border ruffians, and they wouldn't allow it. They threatened to take Newell's mules. These mules cost $11, and before you get them, you'll take my scalp. Newell showed his permit and went on.
Okay. So we're going to fast forward. Yeah, stay there. The other big thing that happened in Jefferson County was a period of 1 week at the end of all the territorial fighting. It was a series of battles that were north of the river, while many had been south of the river around Lawrence with the Wakarusa War, Fort Titus and Fort Saunders. That had all happened before. But now things were moving north, and all the pro-slavers and the Southerners who had moved up here to help make Kansas a free state, we call them South Carolinians. A lot of them were imported from South Carolina, a lot were from Georgia, came to fight. So in Jefferson County, there was a 1 week period where everything in Jefferson County happened. It wasn't all spread out, so it was easy, but the dates are all messed up online because I don't think it was researched well, and another reason for it was the Lawrence paper had been destroyed in May of that year in the sack of Lawrence when they burned the Eldridge down and tossed all the newspaper type into the river. So there was no one reporting on what was going on, and there was no one up there anyway to report on what was going on, except the pro-slavery papers in Kansas. And they were going wild with it. All right, so this is a flag that's at the State Historical Society. It is a flag that says Southern Rights on one side, the other side says South Carolina. It was carried by the Palmetto Guards from South Carolina around territorial Kansas. They tried to defeat the abolitionists and free staters. The flag itself was flown over the burning Lawrence, the newspaper offices, and heralded everywhere except when they got to Jefferson County. They camped out on Slough Creek, a spot we want to find, and J.A. Harvey, another Free State general who'd come down from Chicago, was camped out nearby because he had been up to Leavenworth, where a third of Leavenworth had been driven away from Leavenworth by the pro-slavers, and he was supposed to help out. So he was camped out and in Jefferson County or in Leavenworth County, and Jess Newell got on his horse and went over and told him where the pro-slavers were, or where these South Carolinians were. So Harvey got his group of Lawrence and Leavenworth County and some Jefferson County men and went over, surprised the sleeping South Carolinians, took their guns and horses and got the flag. So I think you have a copy here, don't you? Yeah. So that was one of the battles. They call it a battle in Jefferson County, but that was it. Next slide. These we won't look at because we're out of time, but they show on the left all the crazy things the pro-slaver papers were saying. It was like 10 people killed here, 20 people killed there, no people were killed in those. Next. Those are crazy battle diagrams of the Battle of Hickory Point that have been hiding in the State Historical Society, and the Battle of Slough Creek. Go on. Those are the dates of what happened in Jefferson County in that very brief time, in which ended up not getting a lot of attention from Lawrence. Not only because of the paper, but because they didn't care very much, maybe. I'm not sure what it was, but it was part of the whole idea that the New England Immigrant Aid Society, which did a lot, created the freedom in Kansas. And so we don't know a lot about these, but I've been looking up. I'll go to the next one. That's a drawing of the Hickory Point Free Staters, they went to Hickory Point, they won this little tiny battle. They camped out at Newell's Mills, which was where Jess Newell was building his steam sawmill. And the pro-slavers in the neighborhood had gone to Lecompton and gotten the U.S. Marshal and some U.S. troops to come make them stop fighting. So the troops came and arrested 100 of them and put them in prison in Lecompton. So the picture is showing them going back to Lecompton. But the interesting thing about it is it didn't get a lot of attention from Lawrence, and it was 100 people in prison for months for killing one person. And a lot of them escaped. But they were worried about not being able to make the land sales, but we have to move. This is my out of context quote. I don't want you to read it.
You want me to read it?
Yeah, from a Lawrence person talking about Hickory Point.
And this is the quote about the history of Lawrence, correct?
Yeah.
The town had been demoralized by the sacking of the place in May. The men, too, were scattered. Even the Stubbs, the favorite rifle company at Lawrence, was just then absent on some mission at Hickory Point.
So they were upset because they were about to be attacked, which is understandable, but they were not happy that they were off somewhere doing something, who knows what. So I think I'm out of time, and I won't go on, but I do have a blog, Jefferson County Jayhawkers, which I've been writing in now that I can barely keep up with the information coming out online and on the through the newspapers. So if you look there, it's jeffersoncountyjayhawkers.com. Good.
Ruth and Bill, would you like to take a few questions?
Certainly. You?
I was wondering about the rescue. You have the names of the rescuers of John Dory. Are those the names of the immortals?
Yes. Yeah.
Really?
But so these guys were just assisting them. But yeah, it's such a great picture and story. Yeah.
Were you able to save the stone building?
Jess Newell's descendants bought it, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places, and so they're working on it. They're back there. So. Yeah.
Okay, when they said we were about 12 miles from Lawrence and 8 miles from Oskaloosa, how would they have assessed that? Because they couldn't have looked at the odometer or something. and I never thought about that, but how would they have?
I think they had to have a sense of that. They all traveled by horseback. But go ahead. Time? Yeah.
Something. Odometers were used. I'm not sure of the mechanism, but I know that when Custer was in Kansas with Hancock, they were using odometers to calculate the mileage they were going each day. So the military was using odometers, and if I understand correctly, they go way back.
Both were on wagons.
Yes, they were
Oh,
Oh, good. I didn't know that.
They were on wagons, yes, that they used them with a wagon, so I was
Right,
just so
thank
we're on
you.
wagons.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if our people were that.
It wasn't the horses, it was the circumference of the wheel.
Right.
And they
Okay.
counted the number of revolutions of the wheel, which told them how far they went gone.
Judy,
Excellent.
you have a question?
I want to
Speak up so we can hear you.
thanks so much to Liz and to Bill for finding the ambush site, because I've been researching Dory for quite a few years, and that was just wonderful that you found that out. I would like to make one comment, and that is one reason that John Dory and his son went across at Lawrence and then went west after they got into Jefferson County was that the freedom seekers, the slaves, had been sent across the river higher up at 2 a.m. in the morning near John Doy's house in what is now the Deerfield area, actually, Douglas County, and they've been sent across the river. And so I think that is why John Doy then and his son went west to go pick them up in Jefferson County. They didn't want to take them across at Lawrence.
Right.
It would be too dangerous.
Well, let me ask you this. This is Cameron's Ferry. Is that where they were?
Cameron, yes.
So you think they went across there at Cameron?
Well, like you say, breaking news, just this week I've discovered that, Mr. Hussey, Hussey or Huzzey, I think maybe you came across him also, was a double agent, and he took them across the river. I don't know whether he went on Cameron's Ferry or not, but.
Right. He took them across?
He took them across, and then I think left, went to a mountain and had some.
So Judy's talking about the fact that the ambushers knew this was happening.
Yes.
And so that's why they were able to be there at the right time. Yeah. Yes, Candace. Okay.
Just a clue for you, in the late 90s or around 2000, when Sarah Sawyer and Sherry, my daughter, did the oral history of Jefferson County, a lady from Nortonville, who was the only participant who wanted to remain anonymous, referred to the Underground Railroad location. You can probably find that in the book.
Is that the place where the rocks in the creek and someone carved on it?
She referred to it, I think, as the owners, the homestead. So, and it's been many years.
Saunders?
No, you'll have to just look at the.
Okay, I will. Yeah.
This may well be a Tim question also. You said that there were 100 arrested for the murder of one person, and they were imprisoned here.
Yeah.
And where might that have been?
They were in tents. Yeah, go ahead.
Over on Haldeman Street, the National Hotel, there's a famous lithograph of that of Henry Titus lobbying these men to go down and be filibusters in Nicaragua. There's a famous illustration of that. The National Hotel, they put him wherever they could.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I have a question for Bill. When they did the 1859 survey, have they just laid it over what was already existing? Could that be part of the reason that the property lines in Lecompton, which was already laid out in 1854, don't always match up now with the current surveys?
Probably not. My guess is that the city of Lecompton has outlots and it has multiple different developments. So one individual may have had an addition and they had another outlot of an addition, and people didn't worry so much about 5 feet back then as they do today. So if something was off by 10 feet of the width of the street, they wouldn't have established it. And so then at some point, surveyors like Fred Rogers from Perry, who surveyed, his license number was 64, and he's still alive and surveyed from the 50s. He probably came in and said, I'm going to measure the center of where the street is today, and I'm going to come off of it so far, and I'm going to start putting in pins because this person wants to build a fence, and we've got to establish somewhere that the property is. And so in 1845, when they weren't even subdividing ground, they probably didn't put in monuments for every lot in town, and they're only 25 foot wide. So they were just, somebody since then has came back in, and maybe Fred did one side of town, and then another surveyor came in, made some assumptions 3 blocks over, and guessed off of the street where the lots should have been within that block. And so when you go from one block to the next block, you're going to have errors. That's why when you survey, you want to stay within the block that you're surveying in. You don't want to, especially in an old area, you don't want to prorate your errors outside of the block that you're surveying in.
There's another point to be considered. Mrs. Father and I had adjoining buildings. One was measured from the east end of the block, and the other was measured from the west end of the block. And they didn't come out the same.
No. You'll find a lot of areas that are old. They were generous, and so they would give you an extra foot, especially in like the older areas of Topeka. You'll have a 300-foot block, it's really common to find that block to be 301 feet. They generally didn't short people, and so then you have some people that measure off one end, some people that measure off the other end, and then you get in the middle, and you've got a foot of overlap or a half a foot of gap, you know, or maybe 3 feet even. I mean, it can get different.
About one more question. Yes, right back there, sir. Yes.
So I have a comment and a question for Mr. Knoll. I grew up in northwest Kansas, the most northwest county in Kansas. And when I was about 15 years old, my brother-in-law had a degree in civil engineering, and he became what we called the county engineer at that time.
Yeah.
And he was hired to resurvey what we called the Three Corners area, the corner of Kansas, Colorado, and Nebraska. And I had a little job. I held stakes or something. I don't remember what I did.
Yeah.
The Three Corners area was moved a few feet at that time. And then subsequently, when the satellites came along and we had GPS, it was once again moved 600 feet to the south, the Three Corners area. My question is, you said that when this county was surveyed into sections and maybe quarter sections, it was for sale. Out there, it was homesteaded. Is there an explanation for that?
I don't want to give out completely the wrong information because there's probably people who could answer it more accurately than me. But on the GLO maps of Jefferson County, if you go through that site, Kirk Webb has actually gone in and created a layer where there's colored images that show all the homestead sites. So in some areas, like mostly in Missouri and especially along the Mississippi River, you have these homesteaders who came in, who had a right of claim to the property, and they actually surveyed around those properties. In Jefferson County, they surveyed right through them, but then denoted them on the map. So you'll have a property that's kind of an arbitrary location where they homesteaded it, and you can find there's probably 250 or 200 of those in Jefferson County. But as they moved west, there were more people there, and they weren't going to continue to mess up their square rectangles with funny shaped properties. So they started surveying through those, and then I think they may have provided a legal description to those people for that homestead, but they do depict them on the map. But you know, they were smaller acreages, maybe 40 to 80 acres, where you had large properties along the Mississippi where they actually were thousands and thousands of acres, and in those cases they went around them.
Yeah, and homesteading did not come into effect until Lincoln, the Republicans got in office. They liberalized land policy. Before that time, you had to preempt it or buy it from the government. The first homestead is in Beatrice, Nebraska, and so homesteading was Republican, Lincoln, and effective in Franklin Plains. Okay, well, thank you very much, Liz. Bill, thank you very much. Steve, good job reading through. I want to hand you this certificate. Thank you very much. Excellent program, Liz. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Be sure to come out next Sunday. We've got Ralph Monaco coming over from Missouri. He's going to talk about Missouri-Kansas border war. Thank you very much.
Well done, Bill. Yeah, I read that book. I love it. I'm really so interested in that.
Along the lines of what you were talking about, most of my
Yeah.